The Vietnam War was not a sudden eruption of violence, but the result of decades of colonial history, ideological rivalries, and political ambitions. After Japan's defeat in 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared independence for Vietnam, but France sought to restore control over Indochina. The First Indochina War raged until 1954, when the French suffered a decisive defeat at Dien Bien Phu. The Geneva Accords that followed temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with the Communist North led by Ho Chi Minh and the South backed by Western powers under Ngo Dinh Diem. What was supposed to be a temporary division soon became permanent, as nationwide elections were never held. In the late 1950s, Diem's increasingly authoritarian rule alienated many South Vietnamese. His government, bolstered by American advisors, struggled to contain insurgent activity. Meanwhile, the North secretly supported the Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla movement operating in the South. By 1959, infiltration across the newly formed Ho Chi Minh Trail had begun, linking North Vietnam to the insurgency in the South through Laos and Cambodia. It was during this phase that the Cold War lens magnified Vietnam's importance. Washington viewed the conflict through the domino theory, fearing that if Vietnam fell to communism, much of Southeast Asia would follow. This strategic belief shaped American policy for the next 2 decades. Before we move further, if you want more powerful history documentaries like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten moments back to life. As the decade closed, Vietnam was no longer a local conflict, but part of the global struggle between communism and democracy. With both sides preparing for escalation, the stage was set for a long and bloody war. By the early 1960s, South Vietnam was in political turmoil. President Ngo Dinh Diem's rigid policies and harsh treatment of Buddhists fueled unrest. Protests erupted in 1963, and images of Buddhist monks setting themselves on fire shocked the world. Washington's patience wore thin, and in November 1963, Diem was overthrown and assassinated in a coup supported by elements of the South Vietnamese military. Instead of stabilizing the nation, this event plunged South Vietnam into chaos, with successive governments unable to gain legitimacy. At the same time, North Vietnam increased its support for the Viet Cong insurgency. The Ho Chi Minh Trail expanded into a vast logistical network, allowing weapons and fighters to move into South Vietnam. The Viet Cong launched deadly attacks, undermining rural stability and exposing the weakness of Saigon's government. By 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson faced a difficult decision: withdraw and risk the collapse of South Vietnam, or escalate U.S. involvement. The turning point came in August 1964, with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. U.S. destroyers patrolling off the coast of North Vietnam reported attacks by North Vietnamese patrol boats. Although the details remain controversial, some historians argue that the second reported attack never happened. Johnson seized the moment to push the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through Congress. This gave him broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. What followed was a rapid increase in American presence. By 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam, began. At the same time, the first U.S. combat troops landed in Da Nang. Initially portrayed as a limited mission to protect air bases, their role quickly expanded into full-scale combat operations. American soldiers now found themselves fighting in jungles, rice paddies, and villages against an elusive enemy who knew the terrain intimately. This escalation marked a turning point in the conflict. The Vietnam War was no longer a distant advisory mission. It had become America's war. What began as a regional struggle had now drawn the world's most powerful nation into one of its longest and most controversial conflicts. By 1966, the Vietnam War had escalated into a massive conflict. U.S. troop numbers surged from tens of thousands to over 400,000. with General William Westmoreland directing a strategy of attrition, seeking to wear down the enemy through superior firepower and body counts. American helicopters dominated the skies, transporting soldiers quickly across jungles and rice fields, while B-52 bombers pounded suspected Viet Cong strongholds. Yet despite these technological advantages, victory remained elusive. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and the Viet Cong fought a war on their own terms. They avoided large-scale battles when possible, striking instead through ambushes, mines, and guerrilla tactics. Underground tunnel systems and dense forests provided cover, making it difficult for American troops to find and destroy their enemy. Each battle seemed to repeat a familiar pattern. U.S. forces would inflict heavy casualties, but then withdraw, only for the Viet Cong to return later. Meanwhile, the war was being televised in American living rooms. Graphic footage of combat, casualties, and burning villages increasingly clashed with official government statements claiming progress. Back home, anti-war protests grew louder, with students, intellectuals, and even veterans questioning the purpose of the war. The draft system, which disproportionately affected working class and minority communities, further fueled resentment. The turning point came in early 1968, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, Tet. On January 30th, Communist forces launched a coordinated offensive across South Vietnam, striking more than 100 cities and military targets, including Saigon itself. The attack shocked both the American public and leadership. Although U.S. and South Vietnamese troops repelled the offensive and inflicted massive casualties on the enemy, the psychological impact was enormous. For many watching in the United States, the Tet Offensive contradicted official claims that the war was being won. One of the most symbolic moments occurred when Viet Cong fighters stormed the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon. Though quickly defeated, the mere image of armed guerrillas inside what was supposed to be secure American territory shattered the illusion of control. The Tet Offensive convinced many Americans, including prominent journalists like Walter Cronkite, that victory was out of reach. President Johnson, deeply shaken by the loss of public confidence, announced in March 1968 that he would not seek re-election. The war, once seen as a test of American strength, had now become a divisive and costly endeavor, with no clear end in sight. When Richard Nixon entered the White House in January 1969, he inherited a war that had already drained American resources and divided its people. Nixon promised a path toward peace with honor, a strategy that would eventually become known as Vietnamization. This approach aimed to gradually withdraw U.S. combat troops while shifting the burden of fighting to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. The plan was simple on paper: equip, train, and support South Vietnamese forces so they could stand on their own. In practice, however, the transition was fraught with difficulties. While ARVN units received modern weapons and improved training, they lacked the cohesion, leadership, and morale that years of corruption and political instability had eroded. Many South Vietnamese soldiers doubted the resolve of their government, and desertion rates were alarmingly high. U.S. troops continued to provide crucial artillery, air support, and logistics, meaning the ARVN remained heavily dependent on American backing. Meanwhile, Nixon expanded the war geographically. In 1970, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces launched incursions into Cambodia to target North Vietnamese sanctuaries along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The following year, operations extended into Laos with the same objective. Both campaigns had limited success and high costs, further inflaming anti-war protests at home. Images of bombed Cambodian villages and the tragic Kent State shootings in May 1970 intensified domestic outrage. The war, far from shrinking, now seemed to be spreading across Southeast Asia. At the same time, Nixon pursued a diplomatic front. Secret negotiations with North Vietnamese representatives in Paris, led by Henry Kissinger, aimed to end the conflict. Yet Hanoi remained determined, demanding the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces and the removal of the South Vietnamese government, conditions Washington refused to accept. Talks dragged on for years, with intermittent progress and setbacks. Despite these challenges, U.S. troop withdrawals continued steadily. By 1972, most American ground forces had left Vietnam, replaced by air power and advisors. But the North Vietnamese saw an opportunity. In March of that year, they launched the Easter Offensive, a massive conventional invasion of the South. The ARVN, though bolstered by U.S. air support, including devastating B-52 strikes, struggled to contain the assault. The fighting revealed the limits of Vietnamization. Without direct American involvement, South Vietnam's military strength appeared fragile. By late 1972, with Nixon seeking re-election, peace talks in Paris reached a breakthrough. A ceasefire was agreed in January 1973 under the Paris Peace Accords, paving the way for a full U.S. withdrawal. Yet beneath the political agreements, the reality was grim. The war in Vietnam was not truly over. It had merely entered its final act. The signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973 marked the official end of American military involvement in Vietnam. For the United States, it was the beginning of disengagement after years of bloodshed and political turmoil. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of all U.S. troops, and the return of prisoners of war. On the surface, it seemed like a path to stability, but beneath the ink on paper, the conflict was far from resolved. South Vietnam now stood alone, facing a determined enemy in the north. While Washington pledged continued financial and military aid, it was a poor substitute for the massive American presence that had once propped up Saigon. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, still relied heavily on U.S. supplies, but as the American public grew weary of the war, congressional support for South Vietnam waned. By 1974, aid was drastically reduced, and the ARVN found itself underfunded, undersupplied, and unable to match the resources of its northern adversaries. For North Vietnam, the situation was entirely different. Backed by Soviet and Chinese support, Hanoi rebuilt its strength and prepared for a final push to unify the country. In December 1974, the North launched a major offensive in Phuoc Long Province. The ARVN collapsed quickly, and the United States, despite its promises, did not intervene. The message was clear. South Vietnam would receive no direct rescue from its ally. The momentum carried into 1975, with North Vietnamese forces advancing rapidly. By March, they had seized the Central Highlands, causing panic in Saigon. Entire cities were abandoned as civilians and soldiers fled southward. The ARVN disintegrated under the pressure, and within weeks, North Vietnam's forces surrounded Saigon itself. On April 30th, 1975, the end came. North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, crashing through the gates of the presidential palace. Helicopters evacuated the last Americans and a handful of desperate South Vietnamese from the rooftop of the U.S. Embassy in scenes broadcast worldwide. For the United States, it was a humiliating exit, the symbolic end of a war it had fought for 2 decades without victory. For Vietnam, it marked reunification under communist rule, though at the cost of immense human suffering and devastation. The Vietnam War left a deep legacy. More than 58,000 Americans lost their lives, while millions of Vietnamese, soldiers and civilians alike, perished. It reshaped U.S. foreign policy, creating a deep reluctance to engage in future conflicts without clear objectives. The war also scarred American society, leaving behind questions about power, responsibility, and the limits of military might. Vietnam had been a battlefield of ideology, but its outcome was decided by resilience, geography, and politics. The fall of Saigon closed one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century, yet its lessons continue to echo through history.